So John Lauro, who is one of President Trump's attorneys, went on CNN and had an interview with Dana Bash yesterday, and Dana Bash tried to fact check John on air, and she said, quote, "There's no evidence Joe Biden is involved in this." And so I went through and did my own fact check false, and laid out every instance that we can find at the Article 3 project that President Biden and his senior team are very much involved and behind in driving this lawfare against President Trump, Biden's chief political rival for 2020 and 2020. Okay. It wasn't just the Biden White House, it's President Biden himself who greenlighted this lawfare against President Trump. And I'll go through it. We have back on April 2nd, 2022, you have the Biden aides selectively leaking to the New York Times that Biden was frustrated with his Attorney General Merrick Garland for not indicting President Trump, former President Trump. And if you look at the quote here, the Attorney General's deliberative approach has come to frustrate Democratic allies of the White House and at times President Biden himself. As recently as late last year, Mr. Biden confided to his inner circle that he believed former President Donald J. Trump was a threat to democracy and should be prosecuted, according to two people familiar with his comments. And while the president has never communicated his frustrations directly to Mr. Garland, he has said privately that he wanted Mr. Garland to act less like a ponderous judge and more like a prosecutor who is willing to take decisive action over January 6th. So you have very clear pressure from the President of the United States to his Attorney General with this selective leak to the New York Times over a year ago, knowing that Merrick Garland's going to read this, right? And then what do you know? We have 9 days later on April 11th, 2022, Jonathan Sue, who was then President Biden's deputy White House counsel, relayed to the National Archives that President Biden made the decision to waive President Trump's assertion of executive privilege. And this led to the unprecedented, unnecessary, and unlawful home raid on the former President Trump, the first time in American history for the non-crime of the former President Trump having his presidential records in the office of former president, which is allowed by the Presidential Records Act. Remember, Congress gives former presidents very secure office space, federally funded staff with security clearances, SCIFs. This was a raid, and what we've been talking about for over a year now, Steve, since this raid last August, is this was to get back President Trump's damning copy of his declassified Crossfire hurricane records, which shows that Obama, Biden, and the whole Democrat cabal was behind the Russian collusion hoax. So that's April 11th, 2022. They intentionally misread the Presidential Records Act, or ignored, really, because there's no criminal component to the Presidential Records Act, and they use that pretext of Trump had classified records, which he's allowed to have under the Presidential Records Act. They use that pretext, and they use the Espionage Act to do the home raid on Trump with Jay Bratt, who's now working for Special Counsel Jack Smith. Jay Bratt's a deep state snake at the Department of Justice, and there was even a lawyer on the case who worked for Senate Democrats at the time. So this was a political hit by the Biden administration to go after Trump to get back his damning Crossfire hurricane records and make it look like Trump was violating the Espionage Act by having his presidential records, which he was allowed to have. So anyway, that's that. So let's go back through the timeline. We have CNN saying that Biden wasn't involved. That's nonsense. We have the New York Times leak, April 2nd, 2022, where Biden's mad at Garland for not indicting Trump. Then 9 days later, we have Jonathan Sue, Biden's deputy White House counsel, greenlighting this unprecedented raid on Trump for his presidential records he's allowed to have. On November 9th, 2022, Biden says this in a White House briefing because President Biden is so damn stupid that he says this out loud. Quotes, "Well, we just have to demonstrate that he," meaning Trump, "will not take power by if he does run, I'm making sure I'm making sure he, meaning Trump, under legitimate efforts of our Constitution, does not become the next president again. That means President Biden is using lawfare to go after President Trump. And I left out one of these points in here, but remember, Matthew Colangelo got sent from the -- office in the Biden Justice Department to Alvin Bragg's office to resurrect this zombie case for the non-crime of a businessman settling a nuisance claim. And this theory was passed over by the prior Manhattan DA, the Federal Election Commission, the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan, Alvin Bragg himself, until Colangelo went from the Biden Justice Department to the Manhattan DA's office, Soros-funded Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg, and indicted a former president for the first time in American history for the non-felony of settling a nuisance claim, right? That was like I think in April. And then we have November 18th, 2022, we have Garland saying that after Biden made that pronouncement from the White House, November 18, 2022, 9 days later, a mere 9 days after Biden says that out loud in a White House briefing, Garland appointed this disgraced former special counsel, Jack Smith, who was unanimously overturned and rebuked by the Supreme Court 8-0. For the Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell case, it would have been 9-0, but Justice Scalia passed away. He was rebuked unanimously. It is very hard to get a criminal conviction overturned by the Supreme Court. It is nearly impossible for that to happen unanimously. That shows you what a Scud missile that Jack Smith is, that he will do whatever it takes to take out political opponents and does not care about the consequences. And then after Jack Smith is appointed as this special counsel in November 18, 2022, they wait and wait and wait and wait. And they time these two indictments. 29 months after President Trump leaves office, they indict Trump for the non-crime of having his presidential records. And that's Garland and Jack Smith indict Trump because Garland has to personally approve this. And then 31 months after President Trump leaves office, Garland and his hack special counsel Jack Smith indict Trump for the non-crime of objecting to a presidential election. Notice they didn't charge Trump for inciting a riot because the January 6th kangaroo in the commission in the House found zero evidence that Trump incited any riot. So they don't even charge Trump with inciting in a riot, but he uses the incitement of that riot in Jack Smith's highly inappropriate public comments, but doesn't put it in the indictment. This is lawfare against Trump, and Biden is directly involved.